Hello, I'm Derek Van Gorder, and welcome to CMT Economics, the YouTube show all about basic income and specifically your questions about basic income. At any time, as usual, during the show, just send in your questions or comments in the chat. They should appear on the stream, and I'll get to them as soon as possible. And also, at any time, feel free to join the Discord voice channel. As soon as I'm done with the news, we've got Austin and Eddie there already. And we guys will be discussing the questions in general, and you can ask your comment or question live on the show. Really briefly, just a quick thank you to new subscribers since last time. Sita Zhu, Michelle Beers, Betterment Project Notes, Patrick T. Anderson, and Tom Wren. Thank you very much. We're getting closer to 1,000 subscribers, which is exciting. And yeah, I'm changing up the format. The news is going to be much briefer. I'm just going to give a quick overview of sort of what's a summary of what's been being talked about rather than going over it line by line. And then I can go straight into questions that people have sent in and straight into discussion. So let's get started. So there's a lot being written about basic income these days, a lot of familiar notes. So just really briefly, the New York Times published an article about San Francisco and how San Francisco and other cities are trying out monthly stipend checks to artists. They're calling it a universal basic income for artists. And so reasons for that include allowing them to spend more time on their art rather than finding a second job, and also, assistance during the pandemic and that sort of thing. And then at the same time, the Wall Street Journal has published an article critiquing a similar experiments that are being done where checks are being given specifically, I believe it was to single mothers, specifically to single mothers of color. And the author was saying, well, my single mom when I was growing up, she was poor, and we were biracial, but then she wasn't, so she wouldn't have counted in this program. So they were saying that was possibly discriminatory. I would just like to say that both of these aren't basic incomes. Both of these are cash handouts to particular portions, particular demographics in the population with different reasons given for doing that. Basic income goes to everyone, right? So there's a little bit of confusion going on here. People don't seem to really understand what basic income is. I wouldn't even really say that these are tests of basic income. They're tests of giving people money. If you wanted to experiment on basic income because you were curious what effects it would have, you would have to try giving a smaller amount of money to a large number of people, right? Because basic income goes to everybody. So you would want to see how it affects a larger community. When you're giving money just to artists or just to single mothers, you're only seeing what happens when you give artists or single mothers more money. And the answer is pretty obvious, right? They buy more stuff. It doesn't address the real hard questions about basic income, like what happens to the economy? What happens to employment? Speaking of which, the Epoch Times published, let's reverse that order. So marketplace.org and Epoch Times, they both published these two separate articles about just that question, the question of how does basic income affect employment. So according to marketplace.org, they were saying that it looks likely basic income will not decrease employment. And to back up that assertion, they cite some of the studies that are being performed, the famous one in Stockton, California, and so on, showing that recipients were not less likely to seek jobs. But the Epoch Times, they've published an article about how the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Officer published an analysis suggesting that basic income would cut poverty in half, but the trade-off would be that it would reduce the rate of employment. This is an economic analysis they performed. I'm not really sure the details. I'll have to look. I'll have to see if I can find the details of that. But yeah, I would just say, I think both of these frameworks, when you're trying to phrase the question that way, there's also some confusion about basic income there. And I can answer this question really definitively right now forever. They'll never have to do another study again. It depends on the amount of basic income. So I can say with a lot of confidence, if you pay out a $5 basic income tomorrow, that's probably not very likely to reduce anyone's need to go out and get a job to get more income, right? If you give people $3,000 a month of basic income, probably some people will stop working, right? That we can say for sure. We can't say exactly at what level the effect starts to take place, but we know that it's there, right? So once you know that, the question simply becomes, well, what amount of basic income can we sustain relative to the objectives we want to see? Should we be paying out basic income so that people don't quit working, or is it okay if we have less work? Right? Those are the questions that you'll need to examine when you're trying to figure out what the effect of basic income will be on employment. So that's the gist of things. That's how things have been going. And little quick thing I want to introduce. First time I'm doing this, I'm going to give you guys a official calibration update. So today, these are the three metrics that we would want to keep an eye on if we had an economy who was attempting to calibrate a basic income. That is to say, to try to find the optimal rate of basic income. So given that the basic income rate is currently 0, and we are making up for that with incredibly low interest rates, I'm going to give the US's calibration a rating of 0. We are currently not attempting calibration. And so as that changes, I'll make sure to update you guys and let you know. 1 will be any amount of basic income above 0. 2 would be the maximum amount of basic income that we could sustain under the full employment paradigm. That is to say, we were making an effort to still achieve really, really high employment. And then 3 and 4 would be as we actually start to leave that and we actually begin to actually test the limits of how much output we can get out of the economy, irrespective of how much employment we care to see. So if we ever get to 4, I will close off the show. My work will be done. There'll be nothing more for me to add. But today we are currently at 0. And thankfully, there's a very simple thing policymakers could do to rectify that problem. So that's it for the brief news update. Now I'm going to go into questions. These questions have been posted in the Discord channel, on Twitter. I've collected them from a few different places. And as I go over these, I'm going to hop into the Discord channel. So anyone watching is welcome to join in and we can talk about these, whatever you guys want to talk about, any questions you guys have about basic income or any interest you might have in other people's questions about basic income, that sort of thing. Hop in anytime. There's a link in the Discord channel below. So just go ahead and read the description and I'll put up, we'll be right back as soon as I transition over to Discord. Hopefully I will see you guys there. Thanks.
We're well. I'm well. Anyhow, I shouldn't speak for both of us.
Very good. I'm going to be just testing a few things here, but I think I've got it set up. We should be broadcasting live. And if you have any audio issues, let me know. I'll try to fix it right away. But it sounds good so far. So I don't know if you caught the beginning news there, Austin. Did you check? Did you hear any of that?
I caught some of it, not the very beginning, because I had YouTube on mute without realizing it. But I was there before you got to the Washington Post article about the targeted payments. So I don't know how much that means I missed.
How do you feel about that? Like the whole there's so many projects now and test projects, experiments, and they're being called basic income for this, basic income for that. Like, do you share my assessment that these aren't really basic incomes? Like, this is something else that they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I mean, see, it depends. Like, this is all semantics. It's definitely not the policy I'm advocating for, right? Whatever you want to call it. I like using the word universal basic income, and universal means everybody. Basic means above a certain amount, but not, and also below a certain amount, like that it's not either trivial, it sort of implies a sort of something about the size of the payment, basic, and then income, everyone knows what income.
Right.
But, whereas I know that you and Alex tend to just say basic income, and it's basic because everybody gets it, so it's a baseline, which also makes sense. Like, I don't care about that. But if you're giving money to single mothers or single mothers of color or artists or whatever, then that's a targeted cash transfer. That's, We do that all the time outside America, by the way, guys. Money for, like, I'm on a parenting payment
Yes.
because my family's income is below a certain amount. I have a child under the age of 6. I get a payment. That's a targeted payment. That's the majority of my income right now, but that's not a basic income, right? And because it's not a basic income, I got a message yesterday on my I got a text message from just a random, number that I've never seen before saying your payment will be stopped in 2 days if you don't if you don't agree to an activity plan on job search. So I have what's called a MyGov account, which is my overarching government services account that I interact with the government via. Then I have Centrelink, who actually administer the payment. Then I have something called Job Active, which is a separate administrative layer for people on payments like this, because like I'm meant to be showing that I'm preparing to re-enter the workforce.
Right.
And then I have a fourth party, which is a client, a service provider, to which I am a client, and it's their job to help me apparently re-enter the workforce when I'm finished being a full-time carer. And that but actually they're an enforcement agency, because if they say I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, I'll get my payment cut. And I called her and she says, no, you're fine. You don't need to update anything till September. And the website still says something else. And so there's now the website says that if I don't sort this out by end of close of business on Monday, my income will be cut off. Whereas all the people administering it, the help desk, the woman who is like my supervisor, so that the person who verifies that I'm being a good unemployed person and trying, she doesn't think I need to do anything, but somehow the system is still glitched.
So they're not personally going after you. It's just the system is saying one thing and the phones are saying another.
Yeah. I mean, and like the computer system of the person who's meant to supervise it is saying something different to then the person who runs the tech support, their computer is saying something different. I mean, part of it's just the fact that governments are really bad at setting up web interfaces, is my understanding. They build it. It's just nightmare world from hell where they've given it feels like someone's cousin's got the tender. You know what I mean? Like, how could you be this incompetent? But I think it's also a matter of this, because when you're targeting, then you have to make exceptions, and then you have to make exceptions to the exceptions, and here we are.
Yeah,
right?
I don't see it as just right, because you could imagine the government was super efficient, has the best web developers in the world. They pay the best rates for the websites, right? But even if that's true, there's something, I think this is all a byproduct of a fundamental issue where once you try to when you have this really blurry category about like who deserves the money or not, who's really can't work but is trying really hard, and who isn't trying that hard and is just gaming the system, when you try to tease those apart, you're never going to win, because it's impossible to do that. It's just that's not something that there's ever like a clear and easy answer for. So it's sort of a hopeless endeavor, and it works to the extent today that we kind of get those determinations wrong and we end up just giving people money. That's the good part of the program, and basic income just allows us to stop trying to make those trying to draw lines where it's impossible to draw them, right?
We also make determinations wrong and deny people money, and also I've been also sent a thing saying I was, over the course of the last couple of years, I've been overpaid $2,000, so now I owe the government $2,000, right?
Oh no!
And this is not coming from the tax department. This is coming from even though it's a family tax benefit, blah blah fucking blah. It's a nightmare. But the thing is, you say that they could do it better, right? Like if you had this, and it would still be bad, but you could have this intelligent, well-designed attempt at administering a targeted payment. But if you went over into that realm where you're out of the mindset of we need to punish and humiliate these people because otherwise they'll have too much fun being the poorest people in society, then you wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? Like if you had a smart, like who builds great interfaces? Mark Zuckerberg does, and he wants a basic income, right? Like the people, that's Silicon Valley, all the people who actually know how to make a great interface they have the kind of, that's why one of the places that basic income is most popular, because their thinking is like, how do we make something that actually just works and isn't a hellscape? Because they have to, or people won't use it, right?
Yeah,
So
of
anyhow,
course, but I guess my point is that even if they're, I don't think we need to say that they have this sort of unacknowledged desire to sort of punish people for being poor. Even if they really believe that they want to do the best for poor people who need money, and this is the way to get it to them. Even if they believe that, the fundamental problem of that boundary category is gonna cause all these problems. So I agree with you. There's no way, if you once you make it efficient, you're gonna go away from that whole concept and just do what is
that's,
efficient. Just do the basic income.
we
I
had
think that
Carl Whitequist on the
there's
Australian
a
basic income discussion group. Sorry, Eddie, I'll finish this real quick, right? And he said something interesting, right? He goes, he was an economist first before he became a philosopher. Um, and he was an economist because he wanted to solve the problems of injustice and I guess poverty and blah blah blah. And then he realized, as an economist, it would be easy to solve those problems, especially deprivation. Extreme deprivation would be very easy to solve and have a huge impact on people's lives. But we're not doing it for normative reasons. That there's fundamentally a normative block, that we have this thing that someone will get something for free, and that's not okay, you know.
Right.
Um, yeah, so
That's actually really briefly. That's how I kind of fell into it, because I got into this whole from the normative angle and from the philosophical angle, and then I've actually ended up getting a lot more into the economics, just because I find a lot of the people who are not like sort of on board with basic income and just need a little pushing, but the people that are really against it and will be the serious obstacles, they tend to be making more the kind of square nosed economics arguments, right? So that's sort of why I got into that. But yeah, that's certainly an angle. Hey Eddie, how's it going? Thanks for joining us.
oh hey Derek. Yeah, I think it all goes back to the basic misunderstanding. There's like a default unexamined assumption in most people's minds, and I would even say many or even most economists' minds, that the economy is running at capacity. And if you look at measures of capacity, like capacity utilization, that's actually not true. But then the funny thing is that when you listen to economists and see if anybody talks about that, like in the past year, like I have not even seen a single economist bring up that measure or talk about it in anything except the vaguest terms. Like the MMTers will talk about productive capacity, but then they never go into details about it. And it's I think it's just funny that the Federal Reserve, bothers to create this index and ask the question, what is the maximum that we could actually produce and how much are we actually producing? They have a, data based answer to that. But nobody, nobody looks at it. And most people don't realize that we're at century lows on that measure. We're at the lowest level of utilization in 100 years. So people think that you have to um, you have to allocate income, like you have to what is the word? You have to ration it. People think that you have to ration how much money people are getting, or you get inflation because of capacity constraints, and that is just simply, absolutely not true. And in
Yes.
fact,
Now,
goes the other
Alex and I
way.
would maybe question the ultimate usefulness of that as a measure, because capacity is a much broader concept than you could probably get through that particular measure. That said, I get your point, which is that there's something odd about the fact that they bother to create this statistic, which you would think would be the one everybody would be paying attention to, and then they're not.
Yeah.
No one's paying attention to it. So I understand. I understand your point.
I, yeah, yeah. I think that you guys are talking about like something like long-term capacity. Like it sounds to me that you guys are talking about the long-term ultimate. What's the ultimate limit? And there's no limit to that, clearly, because
No, I wouldn't say
um,
that. We're actually really focused on the present capacity. So when we say capacity, we really just mean potential. It's the same thing that index is attempting to measure. It's just that the way that they've created that measure is by interviewing employers and that sort of thing, interviewing producers and asking them how much could you produce. And we're just skeptical that really gets you at the real question of like, well, how much could we be producing if we really we're trying to achieve that. And part of maybe the reason why people aren't looking at that measure, right, is because they're looking at something else. They're looking at what they assume is the tool that gets them to the most capacity they can. So if we're under capacity, it's like, oh well, that's what we're at right now. This is just a problem we have with the economy. We got to solve it somehow, because they're assuming that when the employment level is high, right, that well, that's going to get us the best that we can get,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yeah, two things. A lot of people use the output gap, which is just a straight line extrapolation. Like if we were growing that much 2 years ago, then we think that we can like straight line extrapolate it. And then some people use employment, which is very wrong because employment labor input can be replaced with capacity input. I'm curious if you guys are including in your concept of capacity, is it that you're including the factories that could have been built by today, but have not been built because of the state of the economy? Is
Yes.
that what you're including? That is
Yes,
what you're including.
we're
Okay,
thinking about, okay, well,
right.
if you maximize
I
consumer
agree.
spending,
Yeah,
what
right.
are what is the how is the economy going to adapt to that? What's the limits of what it can
Yep.
do in the present moment over the next few months, over the next year, right? What can it do?
Yeah.
And that's not something, someone whose business is going to get weeded out because it was less efficient than another business. Like they're not going to give you a helpful answer about that, right? We don't really know. It's hard. It's a
Yeah.
hard thing to know,
Yeah. So
except
I agree
well, go ahead.
with yeah. Well, I agree with you guys about that. I agree with you guys about that. That's correct. There's capacity that doesn't get built, and potentially lots of it, because the consumers don't have the income to buy the production to make it profitable. And so the way that I would put it is just to say that capacity is actually, like the top number, capacity is actually way lower than it could be, and of even the capacity that is built, that number is way underutilized. Um, so that's how I would put it. But even the capacity, even the top line, even if you got to 85%, 90% in the next week, you're right. There's still, it could have been much higher if we had been giving people UBI, in the last 5 years, 10 years, because you would have built much more capacity in that time, if you had UBI.
Right, but so of course this depends on us finding that a plausible theory to test, right? And so if your theory instead is that, well, no, obviously you got to have make sure everyone's employed, that's the way to get to capacity, then you end up in the situation that we're in. So it just goes to show that like we do have to actually sort of wrestle with different perspectives and ideas about how this could go, how things could work. We can't always just look at the data we have and try to optimize for that. Sometimes we have to say, well, what could we be doing that we're not doing today that might boost our potential capacity utilization? And that's true even after we have a calibrated basic income. We don't necessarily know what is this new form of monetary policy going to do, right? What is this new fiscal policy we can imagine? How's it going to affect the economy? Is there something we could be investing in that we haven't imagined yet, right? So
Yeah.
that's you want a
If
definition of
you're
capacity that's broad enough to incorporate all that.
Yeah, and if you're using, employment as your measure of full capacity, that you're way underestimating um, that capacity. I mean, if you have 100 people who are have a doctorate, say from the Soviet Union or something, and they're working as janitors, then they produce $8 an hour. But if you had them doing things that actually that was actually the highest possible utilization of that labor, then it would be much higher. And I would say that is true across the entire economy. Even people who are working minimum wage jobs, if you set them up with a job where they are paired with a high amount of capital supporting that job role, then the productivity is much higher. It's not actually even a function of the person necessarily, as well as it's also a function of how they're set up in their job.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're on the same page with that. Tell you what, guys. So I'm gonna try something here, and you can let me know what you think afterwards. I want to I've pulled up some questions because we don't have any viewer questions coming in. So I've pulled up questions that have been posted in the past, like in the Discord, on Twitter, and I figure I'll pull up a
I
couple
really
of
want to
them.
say something about.
Well,
Yeah, I
okay, yeah.
really want to say
So,
something about the
well,
capacity thing.
absolutely, yeah. Also, that's where I'm going, and then, but absolutely, this also is here for you, right? So, if you have any other points or questions to make, go for it. And then
Yeah,
when we peter out with that, we can move on into looking at these other questions that have come in. But go ahead, Austin.
yeah. So I think first of all, I just want to say, look, the data that Eddie's referring to might not be perfect, but it's something, right? Like it's data we have, and it seems to be fairly consistently measured over time. So it's a toehold on the sort of empirical cliff that you're trying to climb here, right? But then I think we also probably need to have specifically, like CMT will need to develop more of a vocabulary about capacity and be able to describe the different kinds of capacity. So when I was hearing you guys talk, I heard there's at least I think four different kinds of capacity that came up in that conversation. There's the what you could call the potential capacity. So if we there's not leaving aside utilization, just talking about the capacity variable, right? There's potential capacity as in what we could be doing now, or very soon. Sorry, in the very near future, we could rapidly increase capacity by doing X, Y, Z, right? Then there's current capacity. Then there's past capacity, right? And then there's also sort of alternative capacity, like if in the counterfactual world where a basic income had been paid from the 70s or any other policy had been followed, how would that have affected capacity till now?
Mm. Yeah.
Right?
Well, that last
And
point is
all of those
something.
different,
Yeah. Go
yeah.
ahead. Go ahead. Finish up.
I think if we had a vocabulary for all of them, then you could look at the ways that they relate to each other more easily, rather than saying, well, what do we mean when we mean capacity? It's like, well, obviously we have we have different flavors of capacity that we want to compare with each other.
Well, yes. Right.
You know,
So we should be clear what we're talking about, right? And there are different flavors we could break off into, but there is one thing. There is one thing that we're talking about when we talk about economic capacity. What we're talking about is the economy's aggregate potential, all businesses within the economy, the aggregate potential to produce consumer goods, things that people buy with money. Now, I think that answer is maybe too general for many people, and they don't really quite get it. But that is a real thing, right? That's a real and important thing, the average ability of stuff being produced. And this is something that I think you can start to measure, but it just might not be in the ways that people are thinking of it. Now, the thing you mentioned about how could we have been doing if we changed policy in the past, that's something we can't know, right? And so I would clarify that what you really want to narrow on, like, well, how are we doing right now? Are we are we reasonably getting close to our potential right now? And how you're going to measure that, I think, is in through the process that calibration describes. Whereas you're looking at, okay, we have a lever for maximizing consumer spending, right? That we need that in place. You need a way to actually try to maximize consumer spending. You got to have a lever that affects that. And once you bring that up, you start increasing that, you look at the inflation rate. And the inflation rate is your signal. It's telling you in that scenario, now today it isn't, but in the scenario where you have maximized consumer spending, right, specifically, as opposed to just firm and all spending, right, consumer spending specifically, if you've maxed that out and the inflation rate is stable, that means that you are now you've reached your ability to max out that lever. And then if you want to know how is the economy doing in aggregate, you look at everything. You can just look at total consumer spending, right? You can look at, you have the basic income on one hand, which is your free consumption, just the cherry on top. Then you have everyone else's consumption from the necessary wages and profits that are being collected, and there you go. There's your measure of the economy in general. Now you can break it down in an infinite number of ways. You can look at specific industries, and we could say, oh, we want to prioritize some other industry more than this one, right? You can make those determinations. But when economists talk about capacity, we really are thinking about we should be thinking about the capacity to produce consumer goods in aggregate. And it's an aggregate thing. It sounds like, oh, it should be more detailed than that, right? But that's what it is. That's what the economy is here to do. It's here to make goods for us, right? So we decide what goods are produced.
Services.
Yes,
You're including
service is a type of good in this definition. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything that we buy with
no,
money.
look, That makes sense to me. But like the fact that you know what factory owners tell us, the capacity that factory owners tell us is standing idle, is a fairly useful measure of that, right? Especially since we don't, in the absence of you know, a calibration office at the Fed or wherever that's paying out these payments and calibrating up and down. That's you know. Anyhow, the but I just feel like I feel like what you're describing is actually pretty close to what Eddie's looking for, and he's just using the best measure that we currently have.
I wouldn't say that. It's a pretty
ballpark,
extreme difference,
you know?
but it's a pretty extreme difference because in one hand, you're just going around and you're taking individual business. Remember, the economy is not, you know, it's not just the sum. It's not you just add up what all individuals think is going on. The economy is about the total connections, right? About with throughout the whole system, the whole thing. How does the whole thing work in aggregate, right? It's not about like you don't just get a. So I don't think that those individual people are in a position to sort of know how that whole thing is operating, even though they might have a window on their particular business. Now, I'm not saying that if that's comes out low, it's probably it's, you know, you're asking them if there was more spending, if there was more demand, you know, for your particular goods, could you make more? Now, remember that we're not assuming when we're talking about calibration, we're not assuming that we're going to maximize, like take the existing spending flows and just maximize them. It could be the case a lot of these, because all that we want to maximize is the stuff that consumers choose to spend their money at. So a business that is saying, "Oh, I'm under capacity, I'm not doing so well," maybe people just don't want those goods, right? So when you're giving them this hypothetical about how many goods could you be producing, well, when you increase basic income, then that's going to go somewhere else, and then their business is going to collapse. So that information was useless. Now, as a just a rough snapshot in the world we have today.
What, in the door there.
Well, go ahead.
I mean, generally speaking,
yeah.
If you imagine like the general level of spending, and they're not doing very well right now. So part of that reason might be because they just have a product that people don't really want. So they're only at like 50%.
Right.
But if you increase the general spending level, I mean, maybe there are some very specific instances where their business actually goes down. But you would think that generally for most businesses in that situation, their capacity would go up because, you know, there's going to be people at the margin where if everybody has more income, you know, there are people who do want that thing, and there's going to be people at the margin who want it but not enough, you know, based on their current incomes. But if their income goes up, then generally they're more likely to buy more. They're not generally likely to buy less.
Let me put it this way. Imagine we've calibrated. Now, and that once you've calibrated, there isn't anymore. You're at the maximum present level of consumer spending. And so when you go around and ask businesses, like, how are you going to increase, you know, sell more units? You're not promising them, oh, you know, you're not asking them this scenario, an imaginary scenario of, oh, what if there was just more, your customers had more money, right? Because that's already the case. We have the max amount of money. So what you really have to ask them is something more like, okay, well, do you think that next week you'll come up with a great new idea that's going to make people want to spend more money, right, at your business? And if you do, then we can give them more basic income to spend at your business. So it's much more about those kind of like, what cool new ideas are going to show up? Who's going to come up with some sort of new technology that's going to make something more efficient? And now all these businesses are going to be able to produce the same widgets 10 times faster, right? Those are the meaty parts. That's what's actually going to increase capacity. And they're not things that you can just go like, you're not going to be able to go around and ask people and get a really good indication of that. Those are what people sort of write all these op-eds in economics journals about, like, ooh, the next big thing is going to be X or Y, right? And nobody really knows, right? We don't really know.
I kind of feel like there's a little bit of a contradiction between what you're saying now and what you're saying before, because like the definition of capacity you're using, you know, is it today capacity? Is it like right now? So like tomorrow, right? Hitler invades from the moon, and Roosevelt comes out of cryogenic stasis where he's actually been kept because that was what was going on the whole time. Is that we have to keep, you know, Hitler and Roosevelt are both, you know, in suspended animation. They're both back. World War II is on now, immediately, right?
Okay.
How much how much can Roosevelt increase the economy's output?
Oh,
That's like, how much slack is there to start tomorrow in the factories that are standing now with existing technologies,
right
right?
now,
Like that's
in
kind of
that
like,
scenario, remember, this is why we had to clarify we're talking about consumer output. So in that scenario, if you have, like, I'm trying to talk to you guys about the idea of capacity expansion in a scenario that makes sense, in a scenario where we're actually, on average, maximizing capacity potential or getting close to it, right? Through a policy lever like basic income. And then once you do that, um, things look different. So when World War II is on tomorrow, today that means, oh, how much like unused potential do we have? Can we just pull out the stops and the government can do tons of stuff tomorrow? Sure, we can have that estimate. We can try to come up with what that means. In calibrated world where consumers are already receiving the maximum benefit, when Hitler shows up in the time machine and is starting World War II again, if we're going to go fight World War II again, that necessarily means, remember, we're at capacity. So that means that
yeah,
consumer
it means
economy
consumer
now.
spending has to stop,
So then the question
has
is,
to slow
how
down.
many what kind of military goods can we get from pulling resources out of the consumer economy? You're at capacity either way, right? And so what you're trying to estimate the sort of various industrial potentials. And they did studies like this during World War II, and they were asking these kind of questions, like the questions that we sort of should be asking in normal time about, like, well, where do we, what kind of resources do we need, where do we have to pull from, who should we, whose consumption do we have to discourage, that sort of thing. So
Derek,
that war would make you do all of that, right?
I'd be interested in looking at those studies if you could like send me a link or something if it's convenient.
I'm ordering a book about it, so when it comes
It,
in the
seems-
mail, I'll let you know if I
it,
find anything interesting.
it seems to me that fundamentally what the capacity is trying to describe, though, is something material, right? That there's like the factories and the workers in them and the technology that they currently have. That's what you're trying to measure with capacity. Whereas all this other stuff around it is how you would is not actually it. It's stuff that's relevant to it and might affect it. And capacity will grow if there's increased demand, and spending can be more than capacity, and there's all these different ways that the economic arrangements we have can relate to that capacity. But it seems like there's one measure, like current actual existing capacity, right? Seems to me that that's a measure that it only incidentally matters if there's a basic income or not. That will mean that number is, we think that in a world that's had a basic income for some period of time, capacity will be higher than it is now, right?
If
But
you
that's,
if you think about capacity as the economy's potential to make goods for you, then once you accept that, whenever goods go in one direction, money has to go in the other, it doesn't really make sense. Like, you can, I'm you can't the proper measure of capacity then is, well, how high have you gotten that consumer spending lever, right? How much without there being inflation and other problems. That's what I'm trying to describe is, I think, a really cool, a really useful measure of capacity is basically how high is the basic income, how high is overall total consumer spending with a maximized basic income, once you've calibrated, once you've made sure that you're spending is still getting goods and you're at that limits, you actually figured it out. You sort of found out what your present moment potential is, and that potential is going to grow over time. And so then you're going to be immediately following the growth of that potential. You'll find out because you've activated it. So you're now in a scenario where the potential and the activated potential are rising simultaneously. And now when you don't do that, when you're not running at your full potential, it's kind of the equivalent of a bunch of track runners sitting around and being like, well, gosh, like, how fast do you think you could run that track? And the other guy goes, well, I don't know. How fast could you run it? And it's like, well, maybe there's some opinions that are informed about this, but that's not what matters. What matters is running the race, right? So I'm not
yeah,
saying it's totally useless to do this, but it's just that, the measure that I would want people to think about would be calibration. Calibration as a measure of capacity that's
sorry, mate.
simultaneously what's
So
easy to go.
Derek, with the calibration process, as I understand it, you are increasing the basic income over time, and then you're waiting until you get price inflation, and then when you get price inflation, then you are, deducing that is caused by capacity constraints and that you're at capacity. I would argue that it is, it would be worthwhile looking at capacity itself, in addition to looking at inflation, because it's one step closer to the problem. There could be, I don't know, but there could be, potentially um, mechanisms of inflation that are not due to capacity. So
Of
I think it
course.
would be more better to look at it directly. And so you have to ask yourself, how do you measure capacity? I trust the guys at the Federal Reserve for some things, not
So
others, but for some.
I trust them with a lot of things too. I guess I'm saying that what you're absolutely correct that just because you see inflation, that doesn't mean you're at capacity. When you see inflation and you've maximized the basic income, that's different than when we're looking at inflation today, right? It's very,
That's
very
the
different.
basic.
Now, so that doesn't necessarily mean that you're at the highest basic income or the highest consumer spending. You could do if you changed your policies, but it does mean that you're now not
Right,
sitting on
but
any. You're
how
not
do
sitting
you
on
know?
any wasted. You're not sitting on any wasted or unused consumer potential, consumer capacity. And to
Right,
get
but
more
how do
of
you know
it,
that
you'd
you're
have to change
wait?
policies. And then
But
it's your
how do you know that?
question. Yeah, go ahead.
How would you know that you've arrived at the level of maximization? Like you get more spending, more basic income. How do you know that you are? At what point? How do you know that you're now at your maximum?
So income theory of money, right, says that what the general price level is it's the sum total of spending chasing goods. So whatever happens when you see inflation, it means that more spending is not whatever's going on. It means more spending is not releasing more goods
Yeah.
right now, right? So okay, so that doesn't mean right
Uh,
that you're
Yeah,
at potential, but it does mean more spending is not clearing more goods. So then the question is, what's the bottleneck? So once you
right.
maximize basic income, lack of money in the hands of consumers that can't be the bottleneck anymore. So you've erased that bottleneck. So now you're actually money. Consumers have as much money as the economy can handle right now. And then the question is, okay, so there's a bottleneck somewhere else. The bottleneck is somewhere else. The bottleneck is in real resources. The bottleneck is in, uh, you know, uh, businesses still need a certain amount of labor. Well, maybe you could invest in automation, right? And then they'll need less labor, and now the basic income can increase. But the basic income, remember, it's not just the basic income, quote unquote. It's the efficient way in which consumers get money because it's just literally the most efficient way you could do it. If you want to give consumers spending potential, there's like that there's any other way you come up to do it is going to introduce inefficiencies compared to a basic income. So you've maxed the consumer spending out, and now you know that um, now when you're thinking about what's our unrealized potential, you have to think about, okay, where are the bottlenecks and how do we remove them? And then the way then when you go to measure it, you say, well, how do we know that we removed the bottleneck? My answer would be, well, the basic income increases, right? Because now you haven't just guessed that, oh, this is going to be great for the economy if we invest in X or Y, right? Well, you invested in X or Y, and suddenly the Office of Basic Income found, okay, we've got more room now. That's that's uh that's 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 a real measure. That's a real responsive measure you can look at. Whereas if you're just sort of interviewing people about how much they could be doing, you can see by comparison how ineffectual that is, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's not, for specific industries. I think it's useful to make those measures, but when you're talking about the entire economy, the best way to know what the consumer potential is to see how much spending consumers can actually spend and actually get more stuff. That's a good measure in my opinion. At least that's the position I'm taking. I don't know how Alex really feels about that. We haven't really had that discussion yet.
I feel like again that you're gonna have people are gonna have to start being clearer about what they mean about inflation. But you used the track analogy, right? Earlier on about you could just run the track and see how fast you can run it.
Yes.
Well, I think previously when we were discussing it, I used a push-up analogy, right? So maybe today there's the maximum capacity of push-ups I can do is, I don't know, 6 or whatever,
Right.
I can probably do more than 6. I'm just, say it's 10, right? And if I only do 5 of them, then tomorrow it's still going to be 10, or it might even drop to 9, right? My capacity to do push-ups. Whereas if I did if every day I did the max. I did 10 push-ups today. Then maybe tomorrow I could do, or the day after I could do 11, right? And it would
Right.
go up. And if every day I hit my maximum capacity, that maximum capacity is going to rise faster than if I don't hit my maximum, my daily capacity, and then my future capacity, or my like. So we're talking sometimes about we'd have to be setting up, I think, a vocabulary, a sort of a glossary of capacities, right? To be able to talk about it, because I lose the thread
I know
when
what
it's just us three here,
I know what you're
and
saying. Yeah.
we all kind of know what the other person's thinking already, which can make it worse, because
Yeah.
you're sort of double second guessing everything, right? But like, I just think that there's not really any conflict between the approaches you guys are taking. And there needs to be a disambiguation, is all.
Yeah, I think there isn't, obviously there's no conflict in the policy approach. I think it's just the question of, let me put it this way, Eddie. Like, if you believed you had a very solid measure of capacity and you're calibrating the basic income to the productive capacity of the economy, then it would follow that, if the capacity says it's going down, if these interviews are coming back and they're saying, oh, we're losing capacity, it would follow, if you trusted that measure, that you would reduce the basic income. And I'm saying, that's why you want to judge your capacity based on how far you can advance consumer spending while prices remain stable. And if you're doing something else, then you're going to be undershooting it. You're going to be,
Right. So what
right.
I would do, what I would do is, I've already calculated based on capacity utilization, which is not perfect, but it's a good enough estimate. Like $1,200 is probably what we should shoot for. So if I were making the policy, I would start at like maybe 900. I'd go up to 1,200 over a period of about 3 years. And then I would watch capacity utilization. And then if, as you, in your example, the capacity utilization actually goes down. So if that happened, I would go back to the breakdown of the capacity utilization and see if spending is going down, which would be really weird if that happened. I don't expect that would happen. Or if capacity is actually going up. And if capacity is going up, that's wonderful. I would recalculate the the UBI that you can do based on the new higher capacity, and that would give me a basis to increase the basic income. So if capacity went up by 15% in this 3-year period, then I would be confident to then continue
Yeah.
increasing capacity utilization, but also watching spending. So I would be confident to allow UBI, and you have to realize that there's also a spending multiplier in the middle. Like if you calculate that you can get another 1 trillion of spending, you might only need to put out like 500 billion in UBI, because then it circulates and it might cause 1 trillion in spending. And so is what I would be looking at, which is still, that's just spending divided by capacity. That is
Yeah. So this is exactly
UBI.
why I'm saying this
But
is
at
not
a
a good
macro
idea.
level, whereas the capacity utilization where the Fed Reserve is calculating, that is a sample of it's not the entire, it doesn't include the entire economy. It is everything that they can get their hands on where it's easy to measure. There are some
Right.
parts that are not measured, like Netflix. Would be really strange to measure the capacity utilization. It might not even really, might not even apply to them. I mean, they can.
Eddie,
It does.
let me
It
put it
would
this
apply to
way.
the network.
Well,
There would
when
be
you
it would, yeah.
you explained exactly why I don't recommend this, and why I don't think CMT would recommend this approach, because you're introducing this other uncertain variable, this other measure that you take very seriously, and you're going to determine basic income with reference to that measure. And I would just say, well, look, if the inflation rate is above your targets and it's increasing, if you go around and interview people, or however you're calculating it, right? I don't know if you have a satellite that's taking photos and then an AI analyzes them or something. If you know one of those measures is not like the other, and I would not say, oh well, it's okay. The capacity utilization lever is low, so the inflation doesn't matter. We can just let's bring up the basic income. Well, no, you're not getting, basic income increases are causing inflation. It's not helping you, right? And you're not actually getting more goods. The inflation rate is telling you, it's what's telling you that you're not getting more goods out. So
Right. So
those levers aren't
Derek,
working anymore.
The
So
thing is that
conversely,
capacity utilization is, if I can,
yeah.
interrupt, like the capacity utilization is the thing that we're actually interested in. Like, I would actually argue that you and Alex are actually sort of indirectly looking at capacity utilization by looking at inflation, and I would argue that that is actually the measure that has some trouble with it, because, for example, if you start getting inflation, even though we haven't, you could potentially get inflation despite not having reached um, being anywhere near capacity, and you could be getting inflation because there's a loss of faith in the currency, and everybody is dumping their currency, and the currency is going way down. So you could have inflation despite being way under capacity, and that would, I guess, like, if you think that the inflation is happening because of capacity, but it's actually not, then you would actually start, lowering your UBI, which would be the opposite of what you would want to
Well,
do.
Eddie Chu, you're
But that,
saying that in a scenario where people don't have faith in the currency, quote unquote, and you're saying you recommend
yep,
you keep the basic income high. Uh,
yes.
so, look,
And there's definitely
remember that in calibration,
that.
we've
I've got a paper on that,
we've
and
already
we
tightened
need to
interest
actually
rates,
do
right?
another a one-on-one on that.
Yeah, we should
Like,
we can go into that again. Yeah, but basically, I would just say, once you understand the income theory of money, and you actually get that there's an equation that's it's hard to argue with, right? It's really hard to argue that R does not equal PQ, right?
well,
Once you
it's hard to
understand
argue
that, then
theoretical equation. It's math, but the question is not whether the math works. Of course, the math works, but the question is whether that correctly describes the world, and that's where the
you're
that's where
saying the
the
CPI
sort of
or the
problem is.
PCE could be wrong, and we should look at the capacity utilization instead of the PCR, the PCE.
PCE, that's the inflation measure, right?
Yeah, there's many different ways you can
Right,
measure it. These are the two common ones. Yeah.
right. I'm saying that you could be getting inflation despite not having reached capacity. I think
We don't disagree about that.
And
We agree about that. But I'm
it's got to
saying
help to have another measure, right? The more different ways you've got of measuring something, the better,
no.
right? Like when we measure the Earth's temperature, right? Like people say, oh, the sea's warming, and like then you get into it, and of course, all we really ever have is this technique of measuring produces this result, and that's what you have, and that's what you know, and you incorporate that into an ever-growing set of knowledge about the time that this measure reported that, and this the other measure reported. When do the different measures diverge, and then you can understand, well, why is that happening, and new insights can emerge,
Yeah,
right?
and
So it's
I'm not
like,
against the different
yeah,
measures of capacity. What I'm cautioning is I think we also need to have the right interpretation of what the measures mean. So for example, if you're trying to achieve full output and then someone comes along and says, "Oh, well, we got to measure employment, right? That's really important. Businesses need workers. So you've got to measure you've got to measure the employment, right?" And I would say you can measure it, but what outcome do you expect from that measure, right? So, do we change policy in relation to that measure? So you can see the tricky thing here, right? What actually matters is one, being clear on what goal we want, what goal we're trying to achieve with X policy. In our case, basic income, right? Consumer spending. Well, the goal that we want is for more goods. We want more consumer goods rather than less over time. We want more access to. We want consumers to be able to buy more of stuff that they want. That's a very clear goal. That's not like that's something that's measurable. And so, how do you measure it? Well, because we know that the income theory of money is how this works, right? We know there's a relationship between the amount of spending, the amount of goods, and the price of those goods. We know there's a relationship there. If you do a really good job of figuring out what the average prices are, the average price of stuff that's available for consumers to buy, that's going to give you pretty decent information, right, about that relationship. And then
But
assuming that we know how to
assuming
increase consumer spending. If we don't know how to increase
that
consumer spending, then it's kind of all a moot. It's a moot point.
right, the key word there is assuming, because you're assuming that your income theory of money is the correct relationship to apply to a complex situation, and it may be, but it may not be, and that is an assumption that you'd have to check. I would
We could
argue
go into
that
the debates and argue that. I mean, I think it's pretty hard to debate it. But we're coming up on an hour here, so I'm gonna just do a couple of these old questions just because I want to try that out and see how we like it. But this is great. This is what this was for. I'm glad we got to hash this out a little bit, and we can keep doing this. I have an endless appetite for that, and this is what this show is about. Is we should be able to come on and talk about whatever the heck we want. It's a little less structured, right? So that's great, and I think we all agree that we should be aggressively monitoring how the economy is doing. It's not like we can only look at basic income and inflation, but when we're talking about what are the causes that what causes us to actually stop increasing basic income and what causes us to increase it more, to try increasing more, I tend to have a very particular idea of what those indicators should be, right? So I'm gonna push for those, but it's definitely, I think it's interesting to talk about what would be a good way, what would be other ways to sort of judge how the economy is doing, and how should we prioritize certain sectors, because there are other policies besides basic income that will affect capacity, right? So I think maybe one thing that we can do in future discussions is I can clarify that, mostly what I'm thinking about is the capacity of the economy to absorb more basic income, and that's maybe something that that applies more narrowly to what I'm talking about. Whereas what you guys might be thinking about is what are other public policies we can do, where you might want to bring in those. It's definitely going to be useful to have other measures in play when you're achieving other public policy outcomes. Is that fair to say?
I think
Yeah.
so.
Okay, cool. I'm going to go to some of these questions, and I'll read them for you so you don't have to click on the stream. But the first one, here's a question that came up from Phoenix Congress during the last Boston Basic Income live stream, and I don't think that we answered it. So he asks, does economic output always require employment? Maybe a better way to ask is, will economic output always require employment? AI and other automations may change that. So I think he's suggesting, a world where robots take over all or most of the jobs, right? Can we leave out employment entirely? I would say probably no. What are you guys' initial reactions to that?
I would answer that on a relative basis that like 1 unit of increase in output does not necessarily need 1 unit of increase in employment. You can substitute capital for labor. So output it's not tied to labor like on a 1-1 basis. There's no limit to how much output you can get with a given amount of labor, which is good because labor is absolutely fixed. There's only so much labor per person, and you want to be able to have as much as you possibly can without breaking the laws of labor physics.
The laws of or just the how you don't want to break the economy. I think this point confuses a lot of people because they imagine when you're talking about a basic income, especially like a high basic income, they're sort of imagining that like, oh well, so robots come and we don't need work anymore. But I would draw a pretty harsh line in the sand, and I would say no, you're always going to need some labor. It can be true that we can get more output with less labor as a percentage of the population. That can be true, while it's also true that we'll always need some labor. I can't really imagine an economy where we're not using money to motivate anybody to do work for some firms or some institutes, right? So yeah, I think you'll always need employment to some extent. It's just not the case that we need everyone's employment all the time.
Until we get to post scarce.
Well, yeah, but we're using labor and employment interchangeably at the moment, and I think the question is different depending on which one of those you're answering for, right? So if we never need I can imagine a world when we never need employment where all the labor is volunteer, but because I also think money is kind of a quantified stand-in for social status, right? Like, so in small communities, people do things for direct status, and people have a feeling of obligation towards you and respect, and in the community, if you do stuff. And in a monetary society, you can imagine money as a stand-in for that. But you can also imagine a point where the amount of work that's required to keep things moving is very minimal, and it becomes a marker of social status to be doing one of those things. So people compete for volunteer positions, right?
Sure. Now that would mean wages would decrease, but does it mean they'll go away? Is there ever a time where nobody needs to get paid?
I can imagine it, right? And I can also imagine a system where, you know, like you can also imagine a system where that you set up a machine and the machine does everything, right? The machine does all the work and all people do is consume and play and don't do anything productive. But that seems to me, it's a very, and then you can imagine that all the people die and the machine keeps going. And then you've got a world where the machine is doing everything, right? Like what is it? But,
yeah, so
what
none of this
so you can
makes sense.
imagine these scenarios. You can imagine those scenarios, but I think they're very, it becomes more and more implausible because people like to produce things, right? There's a bunch of, I live on a farm that has a garden down the bottom that my sister set up, right? And right now there's a bunch of volunteers here working the garden that she spent money to set up, and no one's making any money, and they're all growing vegetables to give to the local community. So here's a box of organic vegetables
but
for like needy households.
Austin, to clarify, I want to clarify, when we say employment, let's assume that we're talking here about waged employment. So what it means is someone's paying someone else to do work. So obviously there's lots of activities people do. Some of it looks like work, some of it doesn't, where they don't get paid. But we're talking here about money paying for people's time to do stuff.
You're really limiting the capacity, the different ways that people can interact and the different possible social structures. Like living in a monetized.
I just want to be clear. I'm not doing that at all. I'm not saying that at all. Obviously, I would love a world where there's more people doing that category, right, of the unpaid stuff. I'd love that. That's great, and all of that can be helpful to society and the economy. But I'm just talking about. I'm trying to get to Phoenix's question. If we're going to define employment in this context, employment as waged employment, like employment, what economists are measuring, going to a job and getting money. You know, if we separate that out from the other things, we can assume, okay, there's always people doing different stuff that they want to do. But will we ever get to a time where you don't need paid employment, where you don't need to pay people at all? That's where I think it's a little tricky, because are you counting profits as that? Like is someone paying themselves a wage from their
that's not
firm?
Employment. That's not employment, right? Like, so they could be, you know, people could have own factories, and the factories are just a bunch of robots that the owner is programming in different ways, and they're competing in the marketplace to make things cheaper, right? But then there wouldn't be employment, but there would be labor.
So you'd have some people making a lot of profit, and there'd be no
workforce.
They wouldn't need anyone to help them. I know what you're saying. So I can understand that hypothetical situation, and in that hypothetical situation, there's no wages, there's only basic income, and then people who want to collect more basic income as profit, right? And I just think it's unlikely that you'll ever get exactly there 100%, even though the lines between profit making and getting wages, you know, or percentage of profit, that could blur a whole lot more than it is today. I suspect that it's always true that every once in a while, one or two or three of those people will find that, like, okay, I'm mostly good, I have this taken care of, but I just need someone to help me out, you know, on Tuesday, and nobody wants to do it. So, hey, I've got all this money that I collected as profit. I'm going to give you just a little bit of it to get you to do the thing for me. I'm pretty sure that's always going to be around, even in a scenario where, like, compared to today, formal employment is very minimal. Like, it's not what it used to be at all. You're still going to have some people paying other people to show up and do a little bit of work. And as long as we understand that's what we mean by employment, I think I'm very comfortable saying, there's never really going to be a time where you do entirely without employment.
When's never here? Are we talking about, you know, 10 million years in the future?
As long as you have an economy. As long as you have an economy with humans and money. If you want to talk about an economy that's all robots, you could do that, but I'm not interested in that economy. I don't want to live in that one.
No, I mean, I feel like you're subject to what the left likes to call capitalist realism, right? Which is that things which are synthetic and inorganic and you know, decided politically and enforced, right, become like about the capitalist system, become regarded as like organic and natural and the only way and the way that humans are, right? And maybe in the future, if you want someone to help you, you'll have to like be nice to them and make them your friend, and people will like, you know what I'm saying? Like, which is how
I agree with that, but
like,
will it be everyone?
Yeah.
Will it be everyone, or will it sometimes be useful to have unincentive?
It's possible
to help people along.
It's possible that the institution of employment could become ever more marginal until it becomes like the you know, the people who are working in the garden down here aren't serfs, right? So they're working somebody else's land, but they're not serfs, right? We don't have that institution, and employment may become an institution that's just it doesn't make sense to bring it back into existence for the tiny number of use cases that it would apply to, and people just figure out another way. And there are new structures that we haven't thought of yet. And if someone's successful and they've got all this business and they're making all this profit, other people will want to be in on it, and maybe the norm will be that people come in as co-owners. If you want me to work for you, well, you got to give me shares. That's how it works. Rather, because we've all got basic income, so I don't need money to live, right? So I'm not going to work hand to mouth anymore. If you want me to work for you, you got to give me shares. Maybe come the norm in the future, something like that.
Yes, and I actually don't necessarily disagree with that. I've thought a lot about that, and I've tried writing some essays about that. Like I think that's
So that
I think that's
employment.
I think that's
that
very
wouldn't be that would
well. So it might not. It depends,
Labor,
right?
employment.
Well, it depends, right? So let's say that someone promises them a little bit of profit, and then we could say, well, is there a certain percentage of profit that starts to count more like a wage? Like, well, if it's only 1%, I mean, so and so is getting 40% or 50%, right? Because he's the owner, right? So now we're back to a scenario that looks a little bit like employment, aren't we?
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah,
It's similar.
and so all I'm saying is that.
that.
Yeah, I'm saying that I agree with you, and I think that we could have way different cultural norms about work that will be super different from what we have today, and I think they're going to be much better. I think they're going to be great, and I don't disagree with you there at all. And I actually do think that yes, it'll be much more a question of like, if there's a wage, it'll be lower and nominal, and then it'll be like, well, maybe you'll get promised percentage, or maybe you just want to help out. But that could be even become the norm. But I still think it's true that like some firms, there'll be an emergency, they need something fixed right away, and they're going to find that they can, the quickest, easiest way to incentivize someone to do that, and get it over with is pay them some money, and then they'll show up and do it. And if you paid them less, then they wouldn't show up and do it, right? So I'm pretty sure there's always going to be wages of some form or another, and I'm pretty sure there'll be something you call employment. It just won't be the case that most people, or even most people will have to have a job to live well. It just won't be something people will think about, and it'll be a smaller part of the economy. It would be sort of like, in the same way that today, not everyone you meet is a Wall Street trader or or like someone who owns their own business, right? Like those are important that they happen in the economy somewhere, but it's not like everyone's doing it. It's not the norm anymore. So I'm trying to agree with what you're saying, but I'm also saying, I don't think it helps the basic income movement. I'll put it that way. I don't think it helps us advocate for basic income if we are saying, oh, and we're going to get to a world where nobody has to work, right? Because I don't think that's really the goal, right? The goal is we want as much prosperity as possible, and if whatever work we need to get there is fine. It's all dandy. It's just that we don't need everyone's work all the time. We don't need to care about how much employment there is, even if there will always be some level of employment.
Yeah, I agree, but I still think now you're using work as well. So there's work and labor and employment. And I mean, maybe work and labor are the same thing, but I think employment is a very distinct institution, and it may become, and you're the society you're describing. I'm like, well, you get there and you keep going, and then what happens? Like, there's no stable endpoint for how the economy is going to function, right? It's going to keep evolving into something we can't even really imagine unless we all blow ourselves up. And I think what Eddie said before about post scarcity is really important, because like I can imagine a time when people stop using money, right? So imagine you've got a basic income, and first of all, you have to assume one thing is true, that there is such a thing as enough. That there's a point of material comfort and sufficiency that people are like, I don't really care about having a fourth pool, right? For most people, that's possible. If you assume that that's possible, and then you assume that the productivity of the economy keeps going forever, it keeps increasing forever, you reach a point where there's just massive oversufficiency. So a calibrated basic income is now $1 million a day, but people are just like spending, like a few $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not spending all of it. And like we've hit this sort of point of permanent deflation, but it's fine. right? Because no
Well,
one needs a job, so who cares,
well,
right? At
hmm.
that point,
That's not. I don't know what you
paying
mean
the
about
government,
permanent deflation. So you're making a leap, a
forget,
pretty big leap there.
forget that might have been clumsy language, right? So we've reached this point where people are going around and they're spending their money, but it's pointless because they're never going to run out. The person they're paying it to doesn't care because they're never going to run out. Then people just stop beeping the phone when they go past the cashier. People are just like, yeah, take it. And the product, I'm assuming there's even a person in the shop, which there wouldn't be, right?
I'd be
But
curious
the
what
productive
Eddie
line,
thinks about this. I have to strongly
money is
disagree, and
being,
I don't think you're going to get to $1 million UBI and then suddenly we just go to zero UBI because nobody needs money anymore. I don't think that really makes
Well,
sense. I think if basic income is a good idea, it's going to stay a good idea for the foreseeable future.
money. Let me just wrap it up. Like, money is like a psychological trick we play to mobilize real resources. Once we set up a steady enough flow of those real resources, what if the psychological trick becomes necessary? And we just do what needs to be done. And because most people want to be useful, good people and help out, right? Most people don't like plot to fucking, hoard all the, right? Like I don't,
Well,
especially in a situation where there's sufficiency,
it
why would,
it depends on what you think what money is. So if you believe like MMT that money is sort of a way for the government or some larger superstructure of society to mobilize resources to get people to do work, if you think that's what money is, then that's gonna maybe lead you to fantasize about a world where we no longer need money. If you think money is a medium of exchange that sort of allows productive people to trade, with each other or something like that, and maybe you'll think, oh gosh, well, what if the machines make everything? So we don't really have to trade with machines. We just consume from the machines, and we don't need money more. But if you understand that money is a standard of value, meaning that it's a standard of value, it's the standard we use to value things with. You're going to understand that, well, we're never really going to stop valuing things unless we're not around, right? If humans aren't around anymore, maybe we won't need money in an economy. I'll grant you that. But if we're around, we're gonna
I
value,
think that
and if you're gonna
I think
value,
that what
it's gonna be useful. It's gonna
what
be useful to have a common language of value for you and strangers that you don't know who are doing other things on the other side of the planet. It's going to be useful for both of you guys to have a shared standard of value. And since I don't think human value is going anywhere, and I don't think the need for a standard of value is going anywhere, I'm comfortable saying money's going to be around. It's going to be around
so so I think
as
that
long as we have an
yeah,
economy.
I think that Austin is right that if you get to the place where you have so much basic income and you have so much production matching the basic income that you're in post scarcity, and like nobody is ever gets anywhere near zero, like everybody always has money to buy things. I think that at some point, like people will say like, why are we keeping track of this? Like, everyone can always buy whatever they need, so like just tell me what you need, and here it is, because like I think you do reach that point in post scarcity. And I think the like one thing that is relevant is that I think post scarcity is relatively much closer than most people realize. There are a lot of things in economics, in the world. For instance, like accumulated capital. For instance, like things like and the and like for instance, there's like more engineers and more scientists alive today than the entire rest of human history. Like more alive today than
than
in the
dead in
past
history.
like. And so I think
Okay.
that the economy can actually take that exponential um, you know trajectory upwards. And the reason that we're not on it is because of the broken, what Alex calls the broken system of getting people income. And if you get a calibrated basic income, then that actually allows much more investment to go into the economy, and it would actually take the entire economy on an upwards trajectory. And I think it would be much faster than 3% a year. Like
So
I think it
yeah,
could go.
so it's important, I think, when we're advocating for basic income to say things that make economic sense, to not say things that are impossible. And when people talk about post scarcity, what they really mean, I think, is that we can live in a world where no one worries about their basic subsistence. No one has to worry about where their next meal is going to coming from, right? Because resources are much, much, much less scarce than they used to be. And I think to some extent we almost live in that world today, but we don't because it's really inefficiently distributed. But with basic income, we obviously could live in that world really easily. But obviously, in that world, uh, that doesn't mean goods become infinite. There's a really really big difference between saying things are less scarce than they used to be and saying there's no scarce goods. Because I'm pretty sure that we can always come up with new things that we want. That then we're going to have to figure out how to produce more of them. So right now, nobody on planet Earth has a personal spaceship. Maybe in the future, we'll start building these spaceships, right? And then the question is, how do you get a spaceship to everybody? Well, someone's going to have to go from there being zero personal spaceships to, millions of them. And actually, maybe there's billions of us since we got to make more, right? They're scarce
There's
until we make them.
definitely like
So
multiple
economics
stages.
is the
So hold on a
management of
second.
scarce
Let me-
resources.
You can get rid of poverty. That's stage one, and then eventually there's a point where like people have so much money that that they stop keeping track, and that is like
Well,
stage.
that's already the case, Eddie.
question-
So rich people today don't, they can very easily, if they wanted to, sort of stop keeping track of how much money they spend. They are in a quote unquote post scarcity world, but they're in that
They could-
world because
it's
they have a lot of
just
money, because they have
that-
too much
that
money to
makes it-
spend. And I'm comfortable imagining a world where the poorest person in society has so much money that they're not worried about, their next check, where it's coming from. They're not worried like that at all. They feel like they're in a post scarcity world, but they're going to be in that world because they have the most amount of access to the standard goods that are available from the economy, and that implies that they have standard access. They have money, right? Because that's what money is. It's the standard way we get access to goods produced by the economy, and I don't see that ever changing. The more productive the economy gets, the more true that is. The more money you need because the more stuff there is to value. I think that this is kind of a leftover from when we were thinking about money wrong. We were thinking about money like it was something that only exists because we had gold, or it only exists because the state needs labor and all these things. We weren't thinking of it as, oh yeah, the stuff that we value goods with, the stuff that we buy goods from strangers with. You don't need it. You only need it for strangers. You don't need it for your friends, family. You've never needed money for them, really. You only need money to buy goods from strangers. And I think it's always going to be true that we're gonna benefit from having people we've never met and had no connection with and no incentive to give each other stuff. It's always going to be useful to just be able to show up and say, hey, here's a thing you want. It's called money. You have something I want. It's called, it's called a good or something. And you make that trade and it works really well. And I think that's always going to be true. I don't think we should think about basic income as like, it's going to bring us to a much better world, but it doesn't make sense to think about it as what brings us to a world where there's no money. I just think that's wrong. If it were true, then we would want to double down on the Marxist revolution and not get to a world without money today. Do it really quick. Why wait?
You might be right about that, Derek. It might be necessary to run the economy on just to tell people like what machines to build. Even if everybody can always, even if it's enough, always enough.
The question
Right.
is not, is it going to happen? Right? I'm not saying it's going to happen. The question is it possible? Right? And I mean, that's the question I've been thinking about anyhow, right? So maybe the thing is that your money solves a trust problem and a complexity problem, and it allows us to organize this massively complicated economy. But we might have better ways of doing that in the future that we haven't imagined yet. And it seems to me a real lack of you're sort of saying that there's some end point here, right? That we're going to perfect, we'll bring CMT in, and then there'll be a bit of tweaking afterwards, and then we'll get to this end point where the way we think about the economy and the way we think about economics will never need to change again, right?
No, I don't. I don't think that. I don't think that, because we'll always need. There's always policies we can come up with that we can't imagine today. What I do happen to believe is true is that there's some things about the economy that are just sort of baseline, deep level true. They're simple. They're not. You can't actually. Once you sort of figure them out, they just sort of work, and then that's it, right? You can't really. You can find yourself in different situations where different things are needed, but you kind of can't really fight the baseline things that are always true. So one of those things is like, well, some goods will always be scarce, right? that's just true. Like I can't get a planet tomorrow. It's just not available for sale. If I want to buy a planet, there's no way to make that happen. I can imagine maybe in the future we'll get really good at manufacturing and selling planets to people. Maybe they'll be in virtual reality. I don't know. But like for now, I don't get an entire planet. That's scarce, right? But there's a lot of other smaller things that are we can produce a lot of, and then I could get, and then it would be less scarce, right? So there's a spectrum there, and I'm comfortable with that. I think that's always true. So in the same way, I think that there's a
Well,
couple things about money
you
that
can
are always
imagine a
true.
world. You can imagine a world where we're all buying our own planets, but you can't imagine a world where we're not using money.
I agree with
Right?
Derek,
Like,
right? That there's always going to be something that's scarce. Like maybe there's only one Jennifer Lopez in the world,
yeah,
and if you want her
but there are
accurate,
other ways. There would be other
Right.
ways of distributing. There are other ways of solving the distributing just like the
Yes.
problem of who gets
Well,
what.
that's
There
true,
are other ways,
Austin. There are
right?
other ways, and
oh,
that's really
so
important to understand. That's a really important point. So,
I
so
agree
for
with that.
example, like the other way, like in our today's economy, there's other ways to do things. So there's barter, and that still happens. Like people talk about it like it's extinct, but like, well, it's not the standard way because remember, money is the standard way. Money is a standard of value. It's what everyone's using. But barter happens. You barter with friends sometimes, and strangers barter too, and they swap things on online message board groups and that sort of thing. That still occurs. It's just not the standard way, or so it's not easy and it's not immediate. It's not instant. It's not the sort of guaranteed way. So there's those are important. Those other ways that we do things for each other, especially when it becomes like into your personal network, people you've actually met and people you know. Like money won't actually work very well for you when you look at that level of the network. It's going to work pretty poorly if you're trying to get something that you can't get with money, right? But when you're thinking about, you know, millions of strangers, there's this standard way in which we do things, right? And I guess I'm all I'm trying to say is what we call money is just the word we've come up with to talk about that standard way of uh, comparing values with all these different people, right? And comparing things we value with all these different people. It's the standard way to do it. And I think we'll always need a standard way to do it, in addition to all the other interesting and important ways that we come up with to solve problems of goods, problems of services, problems of
No,
behaviors, that sort of
yeah,
thing.
I think that's
I've got to
very
head out, but thanks,
yeah.
Derek. Good to see you, Austin. I'm out. See you guys later.
Okay, nice talking to you,
Fair.
Eddie. Thanks.
Yeah, we should wrap up soon,
We
probably.
should.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, this is about the end of it,
But I just
we'll
like
get to the questions another time.
but basically what I'm suggesting is that there's a future world where where production is a solved problem pretty much, right? Or I'm assuming that I'm assuming that there is some point at which most people stop wanting more stuff, right? Like let's say living in space sucks and you want like a spaceship that's like the size of a private jet that you can fly to any, to the moon base or to your friend's house on the other side of the world, and like that, at least for a period until we get interstellar travel or something. It's kind of a maxed out. Like there's a plateau, a technological plateau, where there's there's not much that's actually enjoyable that can be got beyond. You know what I mean? That what is gettable is cheap, and what's expensive is ungettable, right? So you can imagine a world where where the mode of interaction that happens between friends and family extends and becomes more broad, and it's more, and like how much and this is, I mean, people have imagined it, and it's not to say it's impossible. You have to be saying things about human nature.
No,
Right,
and
and that,
I don't. I
yeah,
agree that
that,
what you just said is possible, and I'm just saying in that scenario where people don't, want more. I guess that means that the basic income plateaus for a while. The money that we just don't need anymore because people are, they have $1 million basic income, and then they're not. They're just. They don't really need that much more. They're not spending more, so adding more doesn't.
Let's say this persists for 100 years.
Yeah.
And for 100 years, every time someone goes to the shop, they've got like a smartphone or a chip in their hand or whatever, and they go bleep on a counter, right, to mark that they've made the sale, right? And like that, even that practice would probably continue, right? But it would be like a register of just what was the item that was sold, and that gets sent to a central computer and says, by the way, guys, one more set of bagpipes was just sold, so we know that now that if the machine needs the inputs to produce bagpipes, we should have them, right? Like that there's and this is all computers talking to themselves, right? After that, at some point, the money becomes this an empty fetish, right? Like, and why wouldn't we just ditch it then? If
I
no one ever runs out,
well,
and like
you wouldn't
it doesn't have
because
any scarcity.
you wouldn't because the computers you're assuming the computers know what people want. And I don't think that you can come up with computers that know that. Like I don't know how you would come up with that. And I think it'll be useful for the robot businessmen or whoever. I think it'll be useful for them um to have this standard in place where people show up and actually you actually get to find out, oh, what do people
Well,
like to buy? What do people like to buy?
I'm imagining now if you need a coordinator for that, they're just a volunteer, right? And so that you can still have people employed without bringing money back, like work labor.
I think I think it just shows you have to go through a
right?
lot of effort to imagine a world where it's possible to not have money, and I'm not concerned
Yeah, well,
about it,
imagining the
and I don't think
future.
that it's I guess like if you want to imagine a
Imagining the
science
future
fiction world
shouldn't
where
be
that's
hard.
yeah.
Imagining the future shouldn't be easy, right? If you're trying to say what can the future be like, and you go, well, it's this obvious thing that makes sense to me now, then you're probably wrong, right?
Sure,
Like
sure, that's certainly true.
you know, it's not a bad thing that this would require. The fact that it would require multiple dramatic transformations fits with what we know about the past, right? We've gone through. People fly now, right? You know, we forget how insane that would be, and that becomes normal. But it wasn't. At one stage, it was this insane, crazy, stupid thing to say that people could fly one day. So.
Fair enough. We'll continue talking about this more some other time. But thank you anyway for going down that that rabbit hole with me. And yeah, I appreciate you guys showing up and chatting with me. This is that's the point of doing the show. So thanks very much.
It's good. It's
Yeah,
really good.
we'll do this again sometime.
All right.
All right, catch you later. Oh gosh, looks like the looks like my mic wasn't working there. That's too bad. But uh yeah, I'm gonna go look into the technical problems. Hopefully my mic wasn't off for too long. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.